Thanks for choosing this free Anfield Index podcast. If you'd prefer to listen to this or any of our other shows without adverts, then now's the time to check out Anfield Index Pro. With AI Pro, you can supercharge your entire listening experience. You'll not only get all of our podcasts without the ads, but you'll have them far faster with our quick publish feature available exclusively for subscribers. AI Pro also puts you in the heart of our sound studio, with an option to listen to many of our shows live and interact with the podcasters in real time as the shows are recording. Upgrading couldn't be easier. AI Pro is available on all popular podcast platforms, and we have our own apps for Apple and Android. Just head on over to AnfieldIndexPro.com and get started today.
Hello and welcome to AI Scouted on Anfield Index Pro. I'm Dave Hendrick, joined as always by Mr. Karl. How are you, sir?
Melting.
Yes, I believe it is 39 degrees where you currently sit. It's a sprightly 21 where I am. We had a hot day yesterday, but nothing like 31 degrees, though I did struggle to get through the day. Guy Drinkle is sitting in the north where it is 34 degrees and he is currently half man, half puddle. So that is the state of the AI Scouted crew today. And today's podcast is a little bit different. We're just going to do something random. Guy has a random club generator and a random nations generator, and we're going to randomly generate clubs and nations and talk about great players or our favorite players from those countries. But before we do that, Karl, let's take a question from the Discord group, which is from Harry Welchie, who wants to know how ridiculously good was the Brazil front three from the 2002 World Cup, and a little bit of a chat about that team in particular. So let's start with that front three. Ronaldinho as the 10, Ronaldo and Rivaldo as the front two. That is one of the great front threes in history. And what's often overlooked is that sitting on the bench was a young Kaká, who would obviously go on to succeed them as the best player in the world for a couple of years. This was a very, very talented Brazil squad, but it's worth remembering this Brazil squad is somewhat unloved in their homeland because they were seen as a boring team because they played a back three, they played with two sitting midfielders. It was the fullbacks and the front three that did sort of the attacking stuff, but they were primarily a defensive team under primarily a defensive manager in Scolari.
Yes, I think the two sitting central midfielders was something that they didn't really appreciate at the time. Obviously, we'd gone through that phase of the 4-2-2-2 as well with Dunga, and again, people were not really keen on having that not all-out attack, not everybody being a really good ball player, certainly from that nation at the time, with the romanticism that there was about it. But I think probably victory in the World Cup final is a good way to try and turn people in your favour and see that, the balance was much more important at that period of time, that they're utilising the skill sets that they had, especially with those wing-backs. They were something else at that time, those wing-backs. There were plenty of nations at that World Cup and previously who played with a back three and wing-backs, but nobody played it like those two did. And it was just that front three, like you say, they were sensational. I mean, Ronaldinho, at his peak, I think, is probably the most skillful player I've ever seen in my life, in the flesh, in the stadium sort of thing. He was just a ridiculous thing to watch at times. He really was. And Ronaldo, as far as I'm concerned, at his peak, there hasn't been a better forward.
Yeah, I don't know that there's ever been a player as talented as Ronaldinho, like naturally gifted. Certainly for me, the most enjoyable player I've ever seen. And if there is someone who was more naturally gifted than him, it is Ronaldo. And, you look at his run from PSV to Barcelona to Inter and what he achieved in a 4-year span was obscene. Then he obviously starts having the injury issues. And by the time he gets to this World Cup, he's already had some very serious injuries. He's not the full Ronaldinho experience, Ronaldo experience. But he does go on to obviously have a great World Cup, having barely played at club level for the previous 3 years. You're talking about 24 games in 3 seasons, 8 0 and 16. He'd missed so much football, and there were huge question marks over him going into this World Cup. And obviously, at the previous World Cup, that's where a lot of the question marks about him started, with the issue before the final. And he went back to Inter. He had a great start to the season. Then he gets hurt. Then he gets hurt again. And all of a sudden, he goes into this World Cup as something of an unknown, but ends up as the Golden Boot winner. Of course, just before these World Cup finals begin, they lose their captain in Emerson, the midfielder from, I think he was either Roma or Juventus at the time. He played for both of those under Capello. But the initial plan was an Emerson, Gilberto Silva double pivot in midfield, 2 defensive players. When he got hurt, Juninho of Middlesbrough fame came into the team. He played in the group stages. But then later on, it was Kleberson, who would obviously go on to play for Manchester United and was, again, primarily a ball-winning midfielder. He came into the team next to Gilberto Silva. And that's sort of where they found their groove, was once he came in and those two could provide a platform, all of a sudden you started to see Cafu and Carlos take more risks going forward and be more almost out-and-out wingers rather than wing-backs. And obviously you had a very strong back three. Lucio is a legend of a couple of clubs, notably Inter Milan, obviously played for Bayer Leverkusen and Bayern Munich as well. Ed Mielsen, who had a good career in Europe with Lyon, Barcelona, a failed spell at Villarreal before going back to Brazil. And Roque Jr., who was a little bit of an enigma, was brilliant with Palmeiras in his homeland, came across to Europe, joined AC Milan. It didn't really work. He had a failed loan at Leeds. He had a failed loan at Siena. He went to Bayer Leverkusen. It didn't really work from there. It's a strange career that he had, because when he joined Milan, he was 24 and he looked like he was going to become, the next great Brazilian centre-back. He was a player not playing regularly at club level, and here he is starting for the team that goes on to win the World Cup.
Yeah, you look at what they achieved and how their careers went in terms of consistency, and you'd say Lucio and he were polar opposites, really. But in this system, in this three, they really did work well. And I think Ed Mielsen was a really big part of that. Like, he played defensive midfield for quite a long time.
Yeah.
Still doing so in Spain, of course, as well. But played in the middle of the back three was almost like allowing those two to do their thing in terms of support and forward play. They were, like you say, a very defensive set team in terms of everyone had the positions and work rate was there and everything was very, very organised. But when Brazil were in possession, when they were looking to open teams up, how often did we see Lucio in particular just running forward and things would have to get out of his way? That was a big part of his game, which was, at the time, not too many centre-backs were capable of doing that. Not something you would see on the international stage with any great regularity anyway. I think people like Sol Campbell certainly did so a few times, and if the teams were playing with the sort of older sweeper system, then you would still see it, but not really in terms of just a centre-back. So that was a big notable thing from that team, and I think Kleberson was a really important, because was it Van Petter started coming in for Juninho at the start as well instead of Kleberson. It was only after a little while Kleberson, with sort of a bit more running power and a bit more box to box about him, came in and sort of made a really, really big impact in terms of their ability to control games from a out of possession point of view as well. But most of that stuff is not so much forgotten as can be overlooked when you see when they were at their best during that World Cup. Was all about the goal scoring, the movement off the ball, combination play between sort of four players in particular, and even probably the players who sort of came off the bench during some of those matches to give them a bit of a late boost. Let's say they would come on and look really, really talented, fresh, and all the rest of it, and it did make a big difference. They definitely had really good depth. Maybe not quite at that Ronaldinho, Ronaldo level, but not a billion miles away from it compared to most other international teams.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, there was controversy going into this World Cup because they left Romario out for the second World Cup in a row. He'd been injured for the first one, but he was adamant he could be fit enough to play. He was in great form at club level come 2002, but he was left out for disciplinary issues, and he made it known he was very unhappy. And I think that's because he was such a popular player in the homeland. That's part of why maybe there was some negativity around this team, more towards Scolari than the actual group of players. But I mean, you mentioned Lucio and his carrying of the ball, and we see Joel Matip do it now, and it's still quite a rare thing to see a central defender pick the ball up and just decide, I'm taking this 40 yards, and God bless anyone that tries to stop me. And Lucio was doing that back 20 years ago, when it was even rarer. But yeah, I mean, like you said, it's the attack that makes this team. Ronaldinho really starting to make a name for himself in Europe at that point, with Paris Saint-Germain. Obviously, he'd move on to Barcelona the following year, and his ascent to being the best player in the world sort of took off. But at this point, he was still just this uber talented player that there were some question marks over at PSG. Rivaldo at this point was rivaling Zidane for the best player on the planet. He had a sensational run at Barcelona, but they moved him on this summer, I think, thinking he was probably at the end of his peak. And they may have been right. This may have been the last great moment from him. He does go on and have success with Olympiacos and a few other clubs a couple of years later, but he was 30. He was, seen as having had his best days. And like I said earlier with Ronaldo, it was, is he fit? What kind of player is he now? He clearly doesn't look the same physically. He doesn't have the same sort of explosive burst. But what he did have was he had an elite footballing intelligence. His ability to know where the space was going to be, to time his runs. His technical ability obviously is not in question. It was always a sensational level. But, that front three before the World Cup wasn't being held up as like, this is the team to beat. These three players are the three to stop, because each of them had question marks over them.
Yes, for sure. And I think Ronaldinho especially, because like you say, he was still playing off the biggest radar, let's say. PSG at that time were nothing like what they are now. This was just a run-of-the-mill French league, run-of-the-mill French team at the time, more or less. There was a big Brazilian influence on that squad, but not all of them amazing players by any stretch of the imagination. And even in the group stage of this World Cup, he started the first two. He was subbed in both of them. He didn't start the third game once they were pretty much through already. So it was still a case of he'd won a place, but he wasn't a guaranteed must be in, always going to be there. He had to perform. He had to put out some really big performances, and obviously the end product that he had in his game at the time. You think of the other players who were in the squad there. Lujao was at that time still thought of being on the verge of going on to be like a really, really big forward for them. They still had Adilson there. Juninho that you mentioned already. Kaká was on the verge of coming through as well. He was only 20 at the time of the World Cup here. And Nielsen as well, who we've spoken about quite a few times. And at that point, was at Real Betis. He wasn't there too long at that point, but he was maybe already in evidence that he wasn't going to be the player that they had hoped that he was when signing. But I think he was there, 3 years at this point, something like that. So he was well established, and he'd had over 50 caps for Brazil at that point. So it was a really, really strong squad. And even without just those attacking players, you look through the rest of them who didn't play a really, really big part. They're still solid, top league, really good sides players throughout that. Junior would be the backup left wing back, basically. Van Beto I mentioned as well. All three goalkeepers are pretty much legendary names in Brazil. All three of them. This was a very, very good squad now that we look back on it, but not necessarily like you say at the time. People like Belletti, like you mentioned him to people now, and they say, Barcelona, and a really good player. He was still in Brazil at the time. He was the right wing back to Cafu, obviously, but only 10 caps heading into it. He was still at Sao Paulo, loads of them still at Grêmio and Corinthians and the rest of it. So it was not necessarily the pinnacle of football going into it, but obviously Scolari got this mix absolutely right.
He did. Scolari absolutely nailed it, and it's worth talking about him. This is a guy who, prior to getting the Brazil job, only a year before the World Cup, had basically been a journeyman manager. Like, he had bounced around. He'd never spent much time in any job. He was at Grêmio for 3 years. That's the longest stint he had anywhere. He went CSA, Juventude, Brazil de Poletas, Al Shabib, Pelotas, Juventude again, Grêmio, Goas, Al Qadisiyah, Kuwait, Coritiba, Criciúma, Al Ahly, Al Qadisa, Grêmio again for 3 years, Jubilo Iwate in Japan, Palmeiras for 2 years, Cruzeiro for a year, and then he gets the Brazil job. And it is something of a shock that he gets the job, because it's not like he had a tremendous track record of success. He'd won the Brazilian League with Grêmio, but that was sort of it. That's all. And sorry, he'd won the Copa Libertadores with Grêmio as well, I should say. But that's 6 and 7 years before he gets the Brazil job. He was something of an outsider getting the job. But he goes on to perfectly cultivate this squad in such a short period of time and lead them to the World Cup. And, you know, when you look back at the results, they obviously beat Turkey 2-1. And this is a game that's probably most famous for an incident involving Rivaldo, where a ball is kicked at his leg and he goes down holding his face. It's, you know, something that brought great embarrassment, I think, on the World Cup. They win that game 2-1. They beat China 4-0. They beat Costa Rica 5-2. Into the knockout stages, they beat Belgium 2-0. And, you know, you look at that Belgium team, and other than Daniel van Buiten and Mark Wilmots, it's not really a who's who, you know, compared to what we've come to expect from Belgium in the last 10 years or so. Then they obviously play England, and they beat them 2-1. That's the game with the infamous Ronaldinho free kick that David Seaman misjudged or whatever. Then they beat Turkey again, 1-0. This time there are no red cards. There's less play acting. And then in the final, they beat a German team who I think at the time were probably heavily favoured to beat them. But it's not exactly a classic German team either. Oliver Kahn, a back three of Linke, Karsten Ramelow, and Christoph Metzelder. Less said about him, the better. Torsten Frings, who I loved. Dietmar Hamann, who was obviously a Liverpool player. Jens Jeremys and Marco Bode, who I loved as well, as the 4 across. Bernd Schneider as a 10, and Miroslav Klose and Oliver Neuville as the front two. That was a team missing Michael Ballack, who was suspended from the final for picking up 2 yellow cards. Oliver Bierhoff, Gerard Asamoah, and Christian Ziege, formerly of Liverpool, coming off the bench. Like, it's not a who's who of German players either, but they'd had a good run to the final. Oliver Kahn was probably the player of the tournament to that point. The defence was working well. There were really hard grafters in midfield. And the feeling was they'd be able to just outgraft Brazil and outfight them. But Brazil really showed their mettle in that final. It's 2 goals from Ronaldo that win the tournament for them. Does any game stand out to you? What do you want to go to from there?
I think a point about Scolari, he ran through his teams there. Those first jobs there before the 3-year stint at Grêmio, that was 10 years of his career, and that was 14 jobs. So I think that kind of displays the depth of what you're talking about, being a journeyman manager. This was someone who sort of kind of almost looks like he just took whatever job was available and just learned, and obviously gradually climbed his way up the ladder a little bit, wasn't afraid to go overseas and take maybe jobs out of the spotlight to try and, again, improve himself there. But that first successful spell at Grêmio is basically what has made him, because he's not gone. There was a little spell at Bunyodko when I think the entire country was trying to put a lot of money into football and trying to attract a lot of people over to that region. But apart from that, it's been pretty much top tier sides, either in his home nation or obviously on the international scene as well. So it was quite something for him to pick this squad and be like quite strong-minded and not really take into account the media in Brazil is obviously a ferocious thing when it comes to World Cup squad selection. I mean, there have been countless instances of players either getting in or not getting in based on what they push and how the public reacts to that. So it was a pretty strong-willed environment in that squad, you would imagine, given he's a pretty unflappable character, isn't he? And I think that was probably what we saw from Brazil throughout most of that early stages of the World Cup, at least. I mean, I remember the game against China was like, people were talking about how good they were, but actually China were an abomination in that World Cup as a football team. Like, they were properly rubbish. Like, so when you get into the knockout stages and there, it's like very, very tight, tense games against okay, but fairly mediocre teams in terms of standing on the world stage. Like, even the Turkey squad was probably the best team that they played in terms of those individual levels that those players were at. But even then, like Hasan Sash, I mean, he had a great 3 years, but that's probably it for his entire career. Emre and Yildiray Basturk were like really, really talented players, but again, not ones who you'd ever say like were among the best in the world. Korkmaz, really experienced defender. Tugay, really controlled midfielder. Rustu Rekber, probably still playing now at 82 years of age.
He was great at the time.
Yeah. These are all like really well-known, really good players, but you would never say that any of them were like, oh, this is a player who probably should have won like 3 Champions League medals.
No.
The only exception there probably being Hakan Şükür. And by that point, Şükür was obviously beyond his prime anyway, I would say.
But Hakan Şükür is an interesting one because he scored for fun in the Turkish league. At Galatasaray, he was an absolute machine. But whenever he left Galatasaray, it just didn't happen for him. So he does well at Sakaryaspor and Bursaspor early in his career, goes to Galatasaray and bangs in goals, goes to Torino, flops, goes straight back to Galatasaray, annihilates everybody for 5 years, goes to Inter Milan, flops, goes to Parma, struggles, goes to Blackburn, struggles, goes back to Galatasaray and scores goals for fun. He was a tremendous player for the country, but at club level, he really did struggle anytime he left the confines of the Turkish league. He's actually had a fascinating life, and he's somebody worth looking up to, or looking up what he's been doing since his career ended. He works as an Uber driver in America. All of his homes, businesses and bank accounts in Turkey have all been seized by the Turkish government. He lives in exile in San Francisco. So do look him up. It's really, really interesting how his life has worked out. But like you said, I mean, they weren't playing the best of the best. That England team, I mean, there's good players in it without doubt, but you look at the English 11, David Seaman, well past his best. Danny Mills was the right back because Gary Neville was injured. Rio Ferdinand and Sol Campbell. Rio was only really establishing himself at that point and was still very error prone. Sol was probably one of the very best centre-backs in the world at that point. You had Ashley Cole at left back, obviously a great player, but still developing at that point. Beckham on the right of midfield. Nicky Butt was starting in central midfield. Couldn't get a start for United, but he was starting for England. Paul Scholes, obviously a great player. Trevor Sinclair was starting left wing. And
Sinclair was in that squad because everybody else was injured.
Yeah.
That was meant to be Kieran Dyer's role initially. He got injured. Danny Murphy got called up and then he got injured and then it ended up being Sinclair.
Yeah. And then you've got Michael Owen and Emile Heskey up front. And coming off the bench, the aforementioned Kieran Dyer, who, like you said, wasn't fit. It was a gamble to even include him in the squad. Darius Vassell. Remember him?
Yeah, I remember being really annoyed that he kept getting brought on instead of Fowler.
And then Teddy Sheringham, who was 36 at the time, well past his best. Like, this wasn't a particularly good time for football, it must be said. This was a fairly crappy World Cup overall. I think the experience of it wasn't great because the games were on at weird times. Like there were 8 and 9 a.m. kickoffs in the UK and Ireland. I remember watching the Ireland games before work, so that will sort of give you an idea of the times they were kicking off at. You're going into work for 7 o'clock to watch the game and then do your day's work.
The best squad in this World Cup was Italy's, and we know what obviously happened with them in the way that they were knocked out. But their squad was probably the one which was packed with the most elite level talent. Like Buffon, Del Piero, and Maldini, Cannavaro, and Nesta was in it, and Vieri and Toldo, and all of those. They were all in that squad. Totti and Doni and Inzaghi and Gattuso. Everybody was there. But obviously the way they got knocked out was, well, it was something.
It was something. It was. And I mean, it was such a strange World Cup as well, because obviously France come in having won the World Cup in 98. They win the Euros in 2000. It's most of the same squad are back for another go at this. And they lose to Senegal in the opening game. One of the worst things that ever happened to Liverpool Football Club, because we signed El Hadj Diouf and Salif Diao. They draw with Uruguay. And they get beaten by Denmark. Spain had a good team at the time, obviously not the team that would have emerged 6 years later, but it was a good team. They topped the group fairly comfortably. South Korea topped a group that had the United States, Portugal, and Poland. Ireland came through a group that was topped by the Germans, then the Irish, then Cameroon and Saudi Arabia. We drew with Cameroon. We drew with the Germans and we beat the Saudis 3-0. England came second in their group. Sweden, England, Argentina, and Nigeria. So Argentina obviously at a very low point as well. And like you said, the Italians had a great squad, but even they struggled through their group. They beat Ecuador. They lost to Croatia, who didn't qualify for the knockouts. And they drew with Mexico, who topped the group. Japan, Belgium, Russia, and Tunisia topping the final group. The Germans beat Paraguay, the US, South Korea. That was their run to the final.
Yeah, it was the easiest one ever.
Ireland, Cameroon, Saudi Arabia, Paraguay, the United States, South Korea. And like that's ridiculous that was their run. South Korea had knocked out Italy in questionable circumstance. Had knocked out Spain, also in questionable circumstance. Just a mess. Ireland had lost to that Spanish team. England beat Denmark and then lost to Brazil. Sweden beat Senegal. Japan beat Turkey. Turkey beat Japan. And I remember that was a bit of a surprise because after the South Korea Italy game, I think everybody expected that one way or another Japan were going through, and maybe they just couldn't put them through because of what had happened in the Italy game. I mean, it was a bizarre time, and we had a couple of sudden death games.
Yeah, can we talk about that?
Yeah, let's definitely talk about those. So we had 3 of them in the knockout phases. We have South Korea, Italy, we have Senegal, Sweden, and then Turkey, Senegal as the 3 sudden death games.
How deep down into the bin should golden goal extra time have gone? And maybe more importantly, would you put silver goal extra time as worse or slightly better than the golden goal rule?
Right. So silver goal was if
there was a goal in the first half. You still had until half time to find another equaliser.
Yes, and then it was over. And a golden goal obviously ended straight away. So the first time I can ever remember this being a thing was the Euro 96 final.
Yeah.
The Germans beat the Czechs. Oliver Bierhoff. Yeah, in international games. It's the first time I can ever remember. So that game obviously ended 1-1, went to extra time, and Oliver Bierhoff scored the winner in the 95th minute. And I remember thinking at that, even though I was delighted that the Germans won because I absolutely adored that team, I remember thinking how cruel it was because there should have been 25 minutes left in the game. Like, the Czechs should have had 25 minutes to come back at the Germans and try and get an equaliser, which, based on how the game had gone, they absolutely could have done. In this World Cup, it was just so strange. So, in the Sweden-Senegal game, Senegal scored after 104 minutes to end that one. And again, you're cutting off the entirety of that second half. So if that had been a silver goal, there would have only been 1 minute left or whatever to the halftime break. In the South Korea-Italy game, there were only 3 minutes left when Jung Hwan scored that goal. So in that one, I didn't really have much sympathy for the Italians. But again, in the Senegal-Turkey game, Turkey score after 94 minutes. So again, there's 26 minutes just wiped away. I think the golden goal was an interesting concept that just didn't work. It took away from what the game is, which is you score now, I have an opportunity to try, and I know how long I have left. I have a chance to come back at you here. The silver goal I didn't mind too much because it didn't end the game. You still got an opportunity to go and try and score a goal, but the golden goal was very, very harsh.
I'm not a fan of golden goal itself, but I thought silver goal was an atrocity. I mean, what is the point of this? What is the actual point of this? To save 15 minutes of football? It just didn't make any sense whatsoever. I'm not having it. That one belongs in the bin along with many other failed rulings.
It's, I could see why they were trying it, but yeah, I mean, it didn't work at all. I'm just looking at the Ireland versus Spain game. Fernando Morientes scores after 8 minutes. Robbie Keane equalises a last-minute penalty. We get it to extra time. Hierro scores. Keane scores. Baraka scores. Matty Holland misses. Juan Fran misses. David Connolly misses. Juan Carlos Valderón misses. Kevin Kilban misses. Actually, Ireland would have been going first. So Steve Finnan scored our last. And we needed Mendieta to miss, but he was never going to miss, and Spain went through. Ireland's World Cup obviously dominated by the Roy Keane walkout. All things considered, it is one of the worst World Cups that we've had. I think it's the worst that I've seen. But a lot of that was down to, obviously, the times that the games were on and how inconvenient it was for us in this part of the world. Do you want to hear the all-star team for this World Cup? There's some good names here, but some questionable inclusions. So the goalkeepers are Oliver Kahn and Rustu Rekbar, which I think is fair. I think they were the two best keepers in the tournament. The defenders, Sol Campbell, Fernando Hierro, Hong Won-bo of South Korea, Alpay Özalan of Turkey, and Roberto Carlos. Cafu robbed. Midfielders, Michael Ballack, who obviously, like I said, missed the final through suspension. Claudio Reyna, Rivaldo, Ronaldinho. Now they've messed about there putting Rivaldo in the midfielders because he wasn't. And Yu Sang-chul of South Korea. And then the attacking players, Hassan Sass, that you mentioned earlier on, Ronaldo, Miroslav Klose, and El Hadj Diouf.
He must have been worth 10 million.
Oh, dear God. Lord. Golden Boot went to Ronaldo. The Golden Ball for the best player at the tournament went to Oliver Kahn. The Yashin Award for best goalkeeper went to Oliver Kahn again. The best young player award went to Landon Donovan. The FIFA Fair Play trophy went to Belgium. Congrats on your participation medal. And most entertaining team, South Korea.
Why not? South
Korea.
It was entertaining, just, people were on the wrong side of what that entertainment was.
Well, let's just pause a minute now and consider the entertainment of the South Korean team in this World Cup. So they play Poland and they win 2-0. They draw 1-1 with the United States and then beat Portugal 1-0. So 4 goals in 3 games. In the knockout phases then, they play the Italians, and the game ends 1-1 and goes to extra time. In the quarterfinals, the game ends 0-0 in an all-time snooze fest. In the semi-finals, they lose 1-0. Where was the entertainment?
I assume in the post-match discussion of what happened.
Of how big the envelopes of money were that were handed out. And then in the third and fourth place playoff, by the way, they lost to the Turks 3-2. Those third and fourth place playoff games are always awful because no one cares. It's just a strange old World Cup. So Ronaldo gets 8 goals, Rivaldo and Klose with 5 each. John Dahl Tomasson and Christian Vieri with 4 each. John Dahl Tomasson, manager of Blackburn Rovers now. Mark Wilmots, Pauletta, Papa Bouba Diop, may he rest in peace, known as the Wardrobe. Michael Ballack, Fernando Morientes, Henrik Larsson, Robbie Keane, Raul, and Ilham Manzis with 4, a bunch with 2 and a whole bunch with 1. It wasn't a great World Cup, Karl.
I've got one thing for you to cheer you up and put this World Cup back on a pedestal.
Okay.
The last player you mentioned there, out of the players who scored 3 at the tournament, Ilhan Mansiz. Take yourself a look at his Wikipedia page. I can only assume he's released himself some sort of musical album. So if anybody's listening, go and take a look. The ocean background, the jumper, the far-flung look into the distance, it's astonishing. Ilhan Mansiz.
Okay, so here we go. So Mansiz learned to skate at the relatively late age of 33 and then became a competitive figure skater.
All right, there you go.
He competed.
Still doesn't explain the photo, but yeah.
Yeah, no, it doesn't explain the photo. The photos. He didn't qualify for the Olympics. The Olympics was the dream, and it didn't happen for him. Ilhan Manzis. Jesus. Yeah, we move. Right, Guy, it is your time to give us some stuff to talk about.
God, it's too hot. Right, David, would you like a player, a country, or a club?
Give us a club.
Club, right. Righty. Well, I'm going to pick one. I'm going to pick the worst of these 8 for you. What are your memories of Stoke City Football Club?
This is not random. I need video proof of this.
Oh, God, this is not random at all. It's definitely been set up here. Well, I think we've all got fond memories of Stoke City. The great Tony Pulis, the man, the myth, the tracksuit. My memories of Stoke, them kicking people up in the air violently for most of their tenure in the Premier League, them spending millions and millions and millions every year for the media to then tell us what an incredible job Tony Pulis was doing with the underdogs at Stoke, even though over a 5-year span, they had the 5th highest net spend in the Premier League, just to finish 14th every single season. Like, just to give you an example of some of their transfers, in the 2009 summer transfer window, Robert Huth for 5 million, Tunke for 5 million, Dean Whitehead for 5 million, Danny Collins for 2.75 million, Karl's all-time favourite goalkeeper Asmir Begovic for 3.25 million, and Diego Arizmendi for 2.5 million. That's a lot of money to spend when you're Stoke. That's the better part of 25 million, which sounds like peanuts now, but go back to that point, and the vast majority of clubs weren't spending that type of money. You had Chelsea, obviously, United some years. We would rarely spend that type of money. Rarely. And when we did, it would be because we had a sale. Their sales that year accounted to about 5 million. So they spent about 21 million net, which, is a sizable amount of money to be spending. And all of those players, well, most of those players are or were not very good. The previous year, like Dave Kitson, 5.5 million. Sehi Olafinjani for 3 million. They binned him a year later. Abdoulaye Faye for 2.25 million. Andy Faye for about $1.5 million. Andrew Davies, 1.3 million. Ibrahima Songo for 2 million. Danny Higginbottom for 2 million. Tom Soares for 1.25. Michael Tong from Sheffield United, who I've got a story about in a sec, for 2 million. Matthew Edrington for 2 million and James Beattie for 3.5 million, all with very little outgoing, about a couple of $100,000 outgoing. Stoke were spending mass amounts of money every single year to finish 14th, and the media were holding them up as this great example of an underdog who, were battling for every point. But they were spending more than teams that were competing for league titles. Michael Tong was one of my favourite midfield players for a number of years. So he played for Sheffield United he came through their academy and then played there for about 7 years. But he played against us in, I want to say, it was a League Cup game. He was only young, maybe like 20. I think him and Michael Brown might have been in the team at the same time. Am I right with that? But I think it was the game with the spitting incident. Yeah, it was him and Michael Brown in midfield. With between Phil Thompson and Neil Warnock had a big falling out over something to do with somebody's spit. It might have been Stefan Ancha walked by and spat on the ground or something, and Warnock claimed he'd spat at them. I think that was around the time Houllier was away from the team when he was ill. But I remember watching Michael Tong, who I didn't really know because I didn't see much of him before that, and just thought he was absolutely outstanding because he was two-footed, could carry the ball really well, was a good passer of the ball, and I was absolutely adamant that we had to sign him for a couple of years. He had a decent enough career, to be fair. The Stoke move didn't work out for him, but he was very good for Sheffield United for a long time, and he was pretty good for Leeds for a couple of seasons. He only actually retired in 2019. He didn't have the career I had predicted for him. But, by the time he got up into the Premier League, he was a championship player when I saw him first. He actually performed really well in a bad Sheffield United team, stayed with them when they went down, moved to Stoke too late in his career. He was 26 or so at the time. He'd just been indoctrinated into mediocre football for too long. But yeah, Michael Tong was a player I did like and hated when he went to Stoke because I always wanted us to sign him. Anyway, that's me. So Karl can go next.
Just a quick question on Stoke. What was your favourite version? That Stoke or the one where they just signed loads of random Barcelona players?
Well, the random Barcelona phase also includes the managerial gifts of Mark Hughes, and that's one of the gifts that keeps on giving, like herpes or crabs. No, it has to be the Pulis version. It has to be the Pulis version because there was nothing worse than looking at the fixture list and seeing Stoke on the horizon and knowing it was going to be an absolutely disgusting 90 minutes of football.
If there was nothing worse than looking through the fixture list and finding Stoke, then why did you put me through the agony every single week of Pulis Watch when you did exactly that?
Because he was at Borough.
To put you through the agony.
Exactly.
That was the whole purpose of Tony Pulis Watch. And it will be returning should anybody ever be foolish enough to give him another job. I mean, he's only 64, so he's a young man, still just coming into his prime years. So I definitely think we could get watching. Now, you need to be careful as well, because I know you've got your eye on a bit of MLS football. So,
oh, yeah.
Anthony Pulis is over there making a name for himself. Now
where did Insigne go? Toronto?
Toronto FC.
Imagine him. Little big man up front. Yeah.
Tony's son is over there making a name for himself. Could well be a head coach in MLS quite soon.
It could happen. It could. There's quite a lot of British players over, or British former players over there doing a lot of coaching and management in MLS and USL at the minute. So maybe him. Quick finisher on Stoke. The only player we've signed from them since the 1950s.
Shaq.
Sean Shaqiri. And 4 players that we've sold or released or whatever to them since the 80s, 70s.
Joe Allen.
Mm-hmm.
Charlie Adam, who prompted Stoke City fans to stand outside the training ground and sing, "We sign who we want," as if it was a good thing that they signed Charlie Adam.
Did Glenn Johnson go them on a free from us?
Glenn Johnson, I think, is the next one, yeah.
And he wore number 8 and I Want to Die. I don't think that counts because it was a free, but...
Yeah, I don't think that one's a direct us to them.
Let's actually just check.
He did. That was his next club, but we didn't.
Yeah, we released him, didn't we? Because he was shit.
One you won't get probably because it's a youth player, and so probably wouldn't be very rememberable. It was John Miles. He was a striker. Sort of.
No, I don't remember him at all. No.
So one more.
Give me an era for the other one.
You've mentioned him tonight.
I've mentioned
Ronaldinho.
Basically, one of the players that we've spoken about in the World Cup just now.
Joe.
It was.
Salif Joe. That's a shout. Oh, if ever there was a fella born to play for Stoke. Oh, yes. We got a bit of money. Did we get money for him? No, he went on loan and then he went on a permanent.
It was a pay up the contract, wasn't it? So
yeah, it was basically go away.
A couple of old, very great to good Liverpool players. Willie Stevenson went from us to them back in the late 60s, and Alec Lindsay in the late 70s.
Alec Lindsay was a cracker of a player. Yeah, I mean, what a guy Salif Joe is.
Istanbul.
Cost us a load of money. Was useless for the 5 years we had him under contract. He went on loan 3 times, and only one of them wanted to keep him. God, yeah, like it's funny with Salif Joe. He plays 40 games in his first season, because that's how many it took to realize this guy can't play. Plays 7 games the next season, then 14, goes on loan to Birmingham, plays twice in a 6-month loan. Then he goes to Portsmouth, plays 12 times in a year-long loan. And then he goes to Stoke in the Championship. Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Played 29 times in the Championship that year. Yeah. Look, I hope he's happy and prosperous wherever it is he happens to be these days.
Absolutely. Now, Karl, would you like a player, a team, or a country?
Let's go for country. We've done a few countries, so let's carry that theme on.
I will do that again because you cannot talk about any of them teams. We go again. Right, I'll let you choose between these two because I've got 4 random ones and 2 of them you can't. Would you like to talk about USA or Cameroon?
Ooh. Let's go for USA. Let's go for USA because there's a bit of a future look.
When will they win the World Cup?
When?
Yes.
They won't.
It's the laws of averages state they will win the World Cup.
Not in my lifetime, I don't think.
Interesting.
That's not me suggesting to the wider world, by the way, that I want to be gone before.
So if they win in 2026, you've got to go.
It's going to be me or them. United States, right. Anytime I talk about United States, not right now, but thinking back when I first watched them, the first image, the first team that comes to mind, Kobe Jones, Alexi Lalas, Tony Meola. That was quite an eclectic mix at the time. Very, very larger-than-life characters. Actually really good on the ball. I think the big problem at that time with the USA international side was there was not that level of play all over the pitch. They were very reliant on a few really, really experienced players. Like a big group of them got like over 120 caps sort of thing. And maybe the organisation wasn't there as well. There was obviously some individual talent and some athleticism. And it was a bit of a mix of the quite good and the not very good at all. But it was quite fun watching like a new nation emerging and trying to get to grips with how things were. And obviously then I would start to read up on how the domestic league was going, and oh my God, that was a roller coaster of a journey, finding out all the different things that they had done and tried to do. The NASL and how that went, the attempts to implement all these mad rules in a slightly new league, which never quite got off the ground, but things like having draws decided by a 30-yard run-in on the goalkeeper instead of a penalty shootout and all this kind of stuff. It was.
I'd be bringing that back now. That's much better than a penalty shootout.
To be fair, I would do that now instead of a penalty shootout, but this was in league play. If you drew the game, they couldn't have that. At the end of that, I wouldn't like that.
You do hate draws, Karl?
I do hate draws, but I play for. I don't play. I wish I played. I support a good side. I think it's very, very important for teams who are not of the elite to still have that capacity to take results. And I think if you work that hard for 90 minutes and get a draw against Manchester.
Plus, imagine having Allison in this 1v1 penalty shootout thing. Free win.
But imagine seeing players shit themselves on the run up.
Yeah.
You just know as they're like still 25 yards from goal, this fella's missing. This guy's definitely missing.
Exactly. I mean, you just talking about that Stoke side before. I mean, how would it be if you had to watch like about their most skillful player for a while was Jonathan Walters, and I wouldn't exactly say he was dribbling was amongst his best traits or characteristics, let alone composure in one-on-one situations and all that. Teams who are built like this, I think it's important that they can still have that outlet to a successful result, like a draw, basically.
No, they just get Rory the lap to start. He's not going to take it. He's going to throw it from halfway, and you've got to catch it or it's good.
30 throw-ins, yeah. So this United States adventure, the whole thing was like quite a wild thing to get caught up in at the time, start of the early 90s and all the rest of it. And there have been like some moments in international football for the United States where I thought like they were on the verge of doing really good bits. Like when they had Jurgen Klinsmann as manager, the atmosphere around the national team at the start was really, really good. They had a few really good young players coming through, obviously. It got a bit toxic towards the end and people didn't really like Klinsmann being in charge and all the rest of it. But for a while there, they've had a few times where they looked like they could have really gone on and not just had a good side, but I mean a really good production line and a route to being in the senior setup. People like, let's say Josh Wolf, for example, as a player who looked like they could go on and be European caliber starting forwards. And they were very, very young into the national team setup and having a good impact at the start of it. But then when either the move comes or they make a change to another MLS side and it doesn't quite work out for them, the thing that USA did for quite a long time was keep these people in the team and try to build the team around them and let them sort of work through at club level. And it was almost like club football and international football were kind of like separate beasts. You've got your spot starting 11 in the USMNT, and it doesn't really matter what happens to you elsewhere. And I think that it took them quite a long time to get past that separation, if you like. And now at the moment, there's reason for optimism. I think that there's some decent players in the squad, but I don't think it's necessarily at the highest point that it's ever been, to be honest. I think even if you look at their neighbours, Mexico has obviously historically been their big rival from Central America, but I would say even like Canada at the minute surpassed USA now in terms of planning and generation of younger players' opportunities and getting good players to go and play for good clubs. I mean, you look through the US squad now, they've got a lot of players in Europe, but whether they are all very, very good players in Europe, not really sure. I mean, a few of them are obviously at a bit of a point of they will or they won't right now. People like Brendan Aronson obviously is just transferred to Leeds, really talented player, still quite young. Will the move work for him? All yet to be decided. But then they've got people like Weston McKennie, who we've spoken about before. I'm a big fan of his. People like, who should we say?
Chris Richards has gone to Palace, isn't he?
Yeah. It's a good squad,
decent squad, but I don't think it's that good. I mean, when you're still relying on people like Cameron Carter-Vickers to come in, be like your new defensive pillar, I think it shows that you've still got quite a way to go.
Well, when DeAndre Yedlin has 74 caps, I think there's a problem somewhere, because DeAndre Yedlin has about as much footballing ability as a turnip. He can just run really fast. So, the move is to get him out of the team. But, there is a good generation of young players. I think Pulisic is probably the oldest of that group, that sort of the next generation. And he's 23 now. He seems to have been around forever. I think, Karl, one of the problems is they play too much football too young. Like, the examples I'd look at, if you look at, say, the Pulisic, as an example, has 51 caps at 23 years of age. To me, that's just too many. I just think that's too much international football for a player to have, especially when they're based in Europe and they're having to travel back all the time. But let's look at Jose Altidore for a sec, who came to Europe a couple of times, had some good spells, had some bad spells, but he broke through with the New York Red Bulls at 17, was in the first team, was playing well. At 19, he's on his way to Villarreal. He flops there. He ends up at Hull. He flops there. He ends up at AZ Alkmaar. He does really well. Sunderland buy him. It's a disaster. Goes to Toronto FC. Does really well there. But he has 115 international caps. And if you look, he's only got 5 in the last 2 years. So he won 110 caps in 10 years by the age of 28. 110 caps by 20. It's too much football.
Isn't it a bit Germanic though? Don't Germany have loads of players with over 100 caps?
Yeah, but they're all in their mid-30s by the time
that was the successful team as well.
Well, yeah, I know, I'm just saying, but comparatively.
But they're going deep in tournaments and stuff, so you're getting 10, 11
true.
games in international tournament years, whereas Jose Altidore played 17 international games in 1 year when he was 20. 2 years later, he plays 13. 2 years later, 14. Then 10, 13, 10, 11. There's a 9-year stretch where the lowest he has is 7 in a year. It's just far too much football for young players. There's not enough been put on development. It's get them to the point where they're ready to play and then let them have at it. There doesn't seem to be any plan once they get to the point where they're on the doorstep of the national team. And there also seems to be, in recent years, some big giddy up to get them all to Europe as quickly as possible. Ricardo Pepe wasn't ready to move to Europe. He just wasn't. And he has looked like a fish out of water at Augsburg. Whereas he was having his first good season at the MLS level. Surely there's some sort of guidance there where these players can be given, better advice. Don't be moving to Europe at 19 if you're not ready, if you've only got one season. And if you are going to move, you really should be going across into an academy setting at that age. But when Augsburg are paying $20 million plus add-ons for a guy, they're expecting him to come across and be first team ready straight away. And Ricardo Pepe just was nowhere close to first team ready. The kid is still only 19. He won't turn 20 until January, a year after he moved to Augsburg. That's just, there's a lack of care there. But it's funny, you mentioned that 94 squad, and Tony Meola was a great goalkeeper at his best. Alexi Lalas is a pillock, but he had a great beard and goatee combination. But you look to that squad, and it's funny how many of them actually came to England quite early. Kobe Jones spent a year at Coventry. Meola spent a year between Brighton and Watford when he was 21. John Harkes obviously was in England for years. Sheffield Wednesday, Derby, West Ham, and a loan at Nottingham Forest a little bit later on. Roy Wegerle was in England from 1986. He came across with Chelsea, had a loan at Swindon, played for Luton, played for Queen's Park Rangers, played for Blackburn, played for Coventry. You forget that there were Americans coming over that early into the English game. It's not just a recent years thing. The one I'm really excited about, and I want you to give me one from this squad that you're really high on. It doesn't have to be that you think they're going to be a great player, just someone you really like. I really like Yunus Musa. I think there's something about his game that if harnessed properly, he could be a really special footballer. And I think he's one that Arsenal could regret losing when he went to Valencia. Now, I'd like to see him away from Valencia, away from the chaos of that club. But I do think he's had a couple of good seasons back to back. I'd like to see him add more goals to his game. But, you know, for a guy that, again, he only committed to play for the national team in 2001. He's still 19. He's got 19 caps. He's got 19 caps. Too many. Just far too many caps to be having already. 8 this year, 9 last year. 8 this year. We're only in July. He's easily going to hit double figures. Like the US men's national team, they play too many games.
Yeah, I think obviously a lot of that comes from like the Gold Cup, and when they have those competitions on in the same years, they have to have the qualifiers and all that. It does really quickly mount up. And I did like, there was a point, I can't remember who the manager was at this point, but they had one period where they just used like MLS-based players or, home-based players for those minor or more minor cup competitions, and maybe called up one or two of the more experienced players to help them along, sort of thing. And I think that was probably a slightly better balance rather than continually calling people back from Europe for a qualifier against somebody they're going to beat 7-0 anyway, to be honest, in the first round before it gets to the Hex, for their World Cup qualifier, which I think is now the Octagon, isn't it, in fact? So, yeah, out of the current squad, Yunus Musa is definitely the most talented outside of, obviously, Christian Pulisic, who we already know everything about anyway. I think Musa has got probably the highest ceiling to go there out of the current group. I do also really like Karl Acosta, who's at LAFC now. Turn the clock back maybe 3-4 years ago, I thought he could probably go a little bit higher or maybe make the move to Europe a little bit earlier. But as an all-round midfielder, really athletic, technically pretty sound, I think he's probably one of the main ones that they should be building around now. He's a very confident player, doesn't really have too many overall shortcomings. There are a few who are maybe not so much involved at the minute because of club form, injuries, that sort of thing. Like Serginho Dest, I think, has got really good capacity to be good for the United States and the way that they play and how they need, the extra speed and the energy and the rest of it. I think, again, with him, it's about finding his best role, whether he is going to be a fullback for them or a wider outlet higher up the pitch. There are a couple of people who have just started to break into the international scene and maybe not picked up too many caps yet. Remember, Liverpool had Brooks Lennon in the academy for a couple of years. He's been on the verge of things at times, and I suppose it depends if he can find a bit more consistency with Atlanta, really. But he's a good player, and he has been capped at full senior level now. I guess the problem with the USA is, like a lot of the time, there's so many players who are capable of being in the squad as like those fringe players, if you like. There's a lot to choose from, depending on if you're going to be sort of home-based squads or you're looking for the best players overseas. And what you just mentioned there before about that push to get them out overseas as early as possible. Two parts of the reason here. One, obviously, some clubs have that as their model and that they want or need to be able to sell them overseas, especially if that comes from the USL rather than MLS. And the other is that the players think they're going to get more recognition that way. And possibly that is the case. If you go over there, like someone like, let's say Matthew Hopp, for example, I don't think he's necessarily been anywhere near star quality, but he's getting recognised because he's playing in Europe. That definitely plays a part of it. I mean, Josh Sargent, if he was playing the exact same performances he did last season for Norwich, but doing it for, I don't know, New England Revs or someone like that, would he have stood out? He wouldn't have, but because he's in the Premier League, he gets that sort of extra, maybe not recognition, or you don't get a free pass and just be in the squad straight away, but he's at least being looked at a lot more regularly than he would do if he was just at a middle of the road MLS sort of side. So I can understand it from their point of view. Plus, obviously, financially, it's a better thing to be in Europe's top leagues if that's where you can get to. But for the national team, I'm not sure it's the best immediate way for them to develop.
No, I don't think it is either. I'm just looking at games played by the US men's national team by decade. Okay. So between 1916 and 1949, they played 33 games, right? So about one a year. They weren't really a thing then. In the 50s, they played 15 games. The 60s, they played 19 games. The 70s, they played 49 games. The 80s, they played 55 games. In the 90s, the US men's national team played 198 games. 198 games in 10 years. It's nearly 20 a year. In the 2000s, they played 172. So again, 17 a year. In the 2010s, they played 190. 190 games, 19 a year. That's ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. And in this decade, which, bear in mind, COVID has had a massive impact, they've already played 36 games. We're only in the third year of this decade, and COVID stopped football for a long time. That is ludicrous. Nobody needs to be playing that many games. I don't care what their qualifying situation is. If it calls you to play this many games, make it change. Make it change, because that is utterly ridiculous. And you can't call up the same squad of players game after game after game if you're playing 20, 17 and 19 games per year. You just can't. It's too many games players, which means you have no continuity in your squad. Now, we both have our issues with Southgate, but one of the things he's done really well with England is he's had continuity in the squad. Now, as you know, I don't rate Tyrone Mings or Connor Cody or a lot of the players he calls up, but one of the reasons he sticks with them is because it's continuity in the squad. He doesn't want 8 to 10 new faces in every squad. It's 1 or 2 new faces, bring them in, ease someone out, and that's how you change over. This US thing is an absolute farce. Like, in the last, where are we? Where's the current squad? So, in the last 12 months, outside of the last squad, which had 3 goalkeepers, 9 defenders, so 12, 7 midfielders, gives us 19, and 7 attackers. So a squad of 26, right? That's 26 players just in the last squad. There were also 4 goalkeepers called up in the previous 12 months. There were 5, 10, 17 defenders, 8 midfielders, and 5, 10, 13 strikers. Like, that's nearly 50 that's what over 50 players plus the others. Like, that's ridiculous. That's 70 players. 70 players called up in 12 months, Karl. I'm sorry, I don't care what national team you are. You don't have 70 players good enough to play for your national team.
No, and I think that obviously a lot of the time they're not. And that's probably reflected in the number of caps that some of them have. Like I say, I understand you've got to have a pathway there and you've got to be able to give some of them the opportunity, but like people getting called up at 18 years of age and not playing a game or playing one game and then not playing again until they're 24 in some cases that we've seen before. USA have played or have got scheduled 15 games for this year already, and that's without any friendlies right before the World Cup or without them getting through to the knockouts, obviously, which will add to it if they progress. So it is, again, a really, really heavy workload in terms of the national team fixture list. Next season is not going to be any different at all. They're in the Nations League matches, which are those ones against like Grenada and El Salvador and that. So those you would think will be, again, the ones that they call up more home-based players for that sort of thing. So again, you're looking at a pool of another 20 to 30 players who are probably not in the list at the moment. Probably not going to be any of them involved in the World Cup squad. So it's going to be all change once more. Yeah.
There has to have been, since the start of this decade, minimum 100 players called up to the national team squad. Minimum. It's absolutely ridiculous. Like, there's just no explanation for having that many players in and around your national team. You can't build any continuity. You can't even know. enough about the players to warrant having them in the squad. It's just not possible as the manager. Like, I know he's going to have staff and he'll have scouts that'll go and watch players, but for him personally, there's no way he's getting round to see all 70 of the players he's had in his squad this year. What they really need to do is have their first team squad of 25 players and then have a B squad of mostly, home-based or, based in Canada or Mexico or South America, whatever, short travel players who can play the secondary games. But the first thing they need to do is find ways to cut games from that schedule. If they're playing any friendly matches, they need to bin them off because there's just no room in your schedule for them. And I would say it's a massive failure on behalf of people like Ernie Stewart, who is the general manager or sporting director of the United States Soccer Federation. Just needs to do better. Just needs to do much better at give your team a fair shot at this. That's ludicrous to have that many players called up within 12 months. Absolutely ludicrous. Like, there's just no need for it. You need 7 goalkeepers for in a year. Ridiculous.
Shall we move on to a random player?
Yes, let's move on to a random player.
So I think we're over an hour, a decent amount over an hour now. So we'll do one random player each. So we'll go with yours first, Dave. Right, we have 6 players, and I'm going to pick 3 for you to speak about.
Okay.
Or to choose from, I should say. So you got Maradona, Iniesta, or Seedorf. Who do you want to speak about?
Maradona. He's the reason I fell in love with football. He's, to me, the greatest player, or he's the best player the game has ever seen. I can see the argument that Messi's the greatest player because of the longevity, the consistency, the fact that when we talk about who the best player in the world was at a certain point, there's nobody who retained that mantle for as long as Messi, who, 2009, I would say, is when he ascended to being the best player on the planet, all the way through to 2019. He was the best player in the world. And that is unmatched. Nobody has ever sustained that level. But I don't think we've ever seen anybody hit a peak like Maradona hit. If you look at when he joins Napoli, who, let's be fair, were a second-tier team in the overall hierarchy of Serie A, he went up against the greatest club side of all time, in my view, in Sacchi's Milan. And he took not 1, but 2 league titles off them. He also won a UEFA Cup and a Coppa Italia. And that was off the back of single-handedly carrying Argentina to a World Cup. And then 4 years later, he carries them to a World Cup final. I think from 86 to 90, that run of Maradona is unmatched in the game. And I know he doesn't have the gaudy numbers of a Messi, but he's playing more as a midfielder than Messi ever did. And he's still, 17 goals, 21 goals, 19 goals, and 18 goals across those 4 years. I think that plus double figures assists, similar numbers to what he has there, playing in a team that doesn't have nearly the level of talent as that great Milan team, or into the 90s as great as a lot of teams that were in Serie A at the time, like even Sampdoria. Inter had more talent than that Napoli team, but he was just able to elevate everybody around him. And then obviously you look at that Argentinian team that he won the World Cup with, and it's a great team. There's great players in it, but there's him, and then there's an enormous gap to everybody else. And if you look at the team that played in that World Cup final, I mean, Jose Luis Brown, Jose Luis Casufo, Neri Pompedo in goal, I forgot to mention, Oscar Rogerio was a great defender. Of the three at the back, he's probably the best known. None of that midfield, bar Burruchaga, are particularly well known. And it's him up front with Jorge Valdano, who's probably best known for his time as the general manager of Real Madrid rather than anything he did as a player. And yet Maradona took them against a German team with Toni Schumacher in goal, who's one of the best keepers ever, Karl-Heinz Foster, Thomas Berthold, and Andreas Brehme in their defence, Lothar Matthäus and Felix Magath in midfield, and Karl-Heinz Rummenigge and Klaus Olofs up front, plus the likes of Litbarski and Rudi Völler coming off the bench. There's no way Argentina don't get thumped by that team without Maradona. And yet they go on and beat them 3-2. All while he has Lothar Matthäus, who's arguably the greatest midfield player of all time. I think you can make a strong case for him because he could play as a 6, an 8, or a 10 at a world-class level. He has him following him around the pitch, kicking him up in the air with no other task for the game other than to follow Maradona. And he still runs the game. He still leads his team to victory. I just think Maradona is the best player we've ever seen. Messi's the greatest because of the longevity and how long he sustained it. But for me, nobody has hit a 4-year level like Maradona did for club and country.
Now you're free to pick from, Karl. And if you don't pick one of these, you're going to ruin the title of the podcast and my day. So you've got Thiago Alcantara, Joshua Kimmich, and James Milner.
Right, after Diego Maradona, I have to go for James Milner, don't I?
You do.
It's the pass the world needed to see.
The torch was passed.
Yeah.
And he was professional.
From cocaine to Ribena.
James Milner, where do we start? James Milner, when I first did not lay eyes on him, but laid eyes on his name, he was maybe the best 15-year-old I'd ever seen by his stats on Champman. So I immediately decided that I'd sign him, I'd bring him through into the youth team, and I'd keep an eye out for him in real life. And then I found out he was on the bench, obviously, a couple of months later for Leeds. Got to see his debut. And now he's ended up winning the league and the Champions League and everything else with the club that I paid for. Goodness me, I keep saying I play for Liverpool. I promise you, I don't play for Liverpool. I wish I did. He has won everything with the club I support. So, although he has no idea who I am, I have been keeping very close tabs on James Milner all the way through. And it's quite a funny thing to me every time we either do an interview with him or, he's doing one of his little post-match sound bites and everything like that. Because, back in the day when I was a very young lad sat at the computer clicking the mouse, I would hold imaginary press conferences in my head with him answering the questions. So there you go. There's a little story about me and James Milner for you. I'm sure at some point I had Ribena while I was doing it.
Absolutely. Do you think because at Villa, I always remember it was the three behind the Carew or Heskey at the time. It was Milner, Young, and Downing. Was it at the time? I think it was Downing. But Milner, he went to Man City and then became a squad player. Do you think if he moved to, I don't know, us or Arsenal or something, he would have been seen as a more... I'm not trying to think of the right word, but more of a recognised
like
good player. Yeah.
I mean, maybe, but I think Milner's, obviously his output didn't change at Man City. His outlook on the game didn't change when he went to Man City. He went there and he was already what he was in terms of he would put the team first. He would do whatever was needed. He would shuffle around positions. He played central midfield. He played on the wing. He played as a support player and everything else. He was always doing this. It wasn't just at Man City that happened for him. I mean, maybe you can say that he obviously would have had more minutes and he might have had a single settled role. That could possibly have happened. But also, I think it's probably underrated how much Milner probably added to that Man City dressing room, because you got to remember this was a side that was taking big strides, quicker than they had ever done before. This wasn't it wasn't like they went from, Richard Dunn straight away to Carlos Tevez or anything like that. There were a few steps in between. So there were some players who bridged that gap, but there were big ego players in there and players who would probably by that point expecting, because of the transfer fee that they paid, the salary they were probably getting, maybe there would have been some in there who were not really doing the work rate or not really expecting to have to do the defensive stuff and not really wanting anything else other than the glamour of the move to this newly rich club, right? I would imagine that people like him, James Milner coming in, was a big strategic thing as much as anything else. As much of a footballing reason for where he could play and what he could do, it was also to ensure that there was still this very, very strong-minded group within the squad who could make sure everyone was training, make sure everyone was working hard, make sure no one was being a prick, basically. And
we really think at 24, though, that Milner had that sort of sway?
Not in terms of like the dressing room, but I think in terms of from a teenager, we've heard his coaches and the players that he was playing with say that he was always like one of the first in for training, one of the ones who was always making a really big impact on people by the amount of work rate he did. Remember when Beckham went over to play for Real Madrid? It was exactly the same. It wasn't about him being a star. He went in there and showed this bunch of stars, this is how you get to be even better, by working really hard and won their respect that way. I think that, Milner definitely would have been exactly the same for that.
I think the move to City, I think, elevated James Milner and how he's seen. Because if you look at the teams that James Milner played in beforehand, at Leeds, at Newcastle and at Villa, when he was a starter, they were all fairly run-of-the-mill teams. They get what would be Europa League now or Conference League now, but they weren't really threatening to win much of anything. He got to a League Cup final with Villa. But that was his level as a starter. And that would still have been his level as a starter. Yes, but as a squad player, he had so much more value as a squad player than he ever did as a starter, because you could throw him in at right back and he'd give you 6 out of 10. You could throw him in on the left wing and he'd give you 6 out of 10. You could put him on the right of midfield, his more natural position, and he'd give you 7 out of 10. And in the following week, he's out of the team for a couple of games, and then he's back, and he can come off the bench and he can help you see a game out. He can help you change the formation if you're chasing your game. So his real value has always been as a squad player. James Milner has never been good enough to be a starter in a team winning honours. If you look at all the honours he has, he's always been a squad player. Now, he did start a bunch of games for City, obviously, especially in the first league title win, but he didn't have a set position. He played right wing, left wing, played in the midfield 3, played up front in one game, played full back. That's where Milner's ability to be 6 out of 10 in a bunch of positions is more valuable than his ability to be a 7 out of 10 player as a starter. And when we signed him, you could see that. We weren't particularly good when he was a starter. I know we got to a European Cup final, but he was the worst player in that team, bar Lovren. We had Van Dijk, we had Salah, we had Mane, we had Gini Wijnaldum. We had really good players in that, Andy Robertson, really good players in that team.
I thought you were on about the Europa League, yeah.
Oh, no. God, no. But again, like you look at Milner and his career, and pretty much all of the cups he's won, he wasn't a starter. You look at his FA Cup with City, I think he came off the bench. I think it was the same thing with his League Cup with City. Came off the bench, obviously, for us in the 2 cups we won. The finals that he started, I think he's lost all of them. So his best role has always been as a squad player. His ability to just fit in. And I think a lot of Milner's ability or Milner's traits as a leader and standard setter get overblown. Not to say that it's not important, but I think people hear, James Milner helped set the standards at the club, and they think, he's in there and he's rah-rah-rahing and he's grabbing lads and he's telling them, this, that, and the other thing. And it's not that. James Milner's ability has always been to go in and do his job, to the very best of his ability and just get on with things, regardless of whether he's in the team or out of the team, regardless of whether he's starting in his preferred position or he's been asked to play left back. He just gets on with it. And Karl mentioned the big egos at City. And I would say there were some enormous egos in that Manchester City squad. Number 9, Emmanuel Adebayor, being a prime example, who barely played that season, was known to be disruptive. But I think having the likes of Milner, one Milner can balance out kind of 2 Adebayors, because lads will look at a Milner and think, well, he's just getting on with it. Let's just fucking get on with it. Let's just get on and do what we've been asked to do. If he's willing to do it, we can do it as well. Because, you know, he did arrive at City for big money. I think they paid, was it 20 million?
Yeah, not shy of
£26 million.
There was you know, obviously the part of the transfers that City had to make at that time, because they were signing so many overseas players, was to buy English players. I mean, there was John Scott like the summer before, I think it was. I'm not sure.
Gareth Barry
time as well. Yeah. So like they did have to bring in home-based players as well. And Milner was at that time, I think, someone who you would look at outside the top 6 was probably around the top of that group. I think that's probably fair to say. You know, he was playing really well for Villa. He was playing really regularly for Villa. I don't think, like I said at the start, I don't think he would have ever have been necessarily a better player, a bigger player, if he'd have gone one step below City or if he'd have stayed at the same level as Villa. You know, Villa were basically the next team at that point. You know, they were not the Champions League sides, but the ones
they finished 6th. Yeah, they were in that Europa League sort of battle.
Yeah, so I don't think that there was anywhere else for him to go other than this. This is what I just said at the start. I don't think he would have been a different player. I think by that point you already knew what you were getting. He was not a youngster who was going to improve his end product or something like that. This was just about learning curve of the game, basically, that you get between sort of 23 and 28 sort of thing. That's the additional game time and the additional experiences that you will have by being on the pitch. He wasn't going to become functionally a different player or a more exciting player because of it. It was just going to be a starter at the same sort of level, or he would go a little bit higher and be a bit of a squad player maybe. If he had a really great, like he was like, who can we relate this to? Let's say when Dirk Kuyt went right wing for Liverpool, right? He was not necessarily unbelievably good every single game, but he had everything off the ball, everything tactically, everything mentally, everything athletically that you would want, and therefore he started every single game. Now Milner has maybe not been quite as end producty as Kuyt was because he was forward and maybe hasn't quite had the settled role that Kuyt did after that period, because he's played for teams with much bigger squads and much bigger spending power than we had at the time. Basically, then if that Kuyt didn't play, it was like, all right, let's bring in this 16-year-old or stick David N'Gog out right wing or something like that.
Nabil El-Zar.
Exactly. That was what Liverpool's squad was at that time. So I would suspect that if Milner had have gone to like ourselves or Arsenal at that sort of time instead of City, it would have been a similar thing. He would have played nearly every single week in that right-sided role. You're out the way, but you'll protect your defender, you'll do the job, and you focus on improving the rest of the team each summer. That's what would have happened for Milner, I think. So he's picked this way instead, and it's not exactly worked out badly for him, has it?
That was a good Villa team as well. Like, they finished 6th 3 years in a row. Milner was there for 2 of them. But you look at some of the names, like Gareth Barry had a very long, productive career. Ashley Young is still playing, has had a long, productive career. He obviously played in the front 3. You had Gabby Agbonlahor, again, a fairly long career, not very good, but he was around a long time. Stilian Petrov in midfield, Brad Friedel in goal, Curtis Davies, who at one point looked like he could become an England international, still going at Derby at centre-back, Luke Young at right-back, who Roy Hodgson tried to sign for us and turned us down, Milner in midfield, Nigel Rio Coker, who again had a long career, Carlos Cuellar, John Carew. Like, there's a lot of decent players there.
And then they just needed more goals to get over the
That's literally it. So Gareth Barry leaves in the summer of 2009, and they bring in Stuart Downing, and obviously James Collins and Richard Dunn, and the less said about them, the better. But, you know, they brought in Stuart Downing in the hope of turning things around a little bit for them. And again, you've got Milner, Petrov, and I'm trying to think who the third midfielder that year would have been. Steve Sidwell. So that's your midfield three. And then you've got Downing, Ashley Young, and Gabby Ogbonlahor as your front three. Like, it's a solid team. It's not spectacular in any way, but it's a solid team full of lads that won a lot of international caps and played for a long, long time. And that is Milner's level as a starter, is sixth, which was absolutely fine. But for him to take his career to the next level, he had to put his ego, whatever ego he might have. Every footballer has an ego. But he had to park that, go to City and accept that I'm not going to be a starter every game. In the best 11, I probably don't get in the team. But I can be super valuable here by being like the 12th man. And if I'm the 12th man and anyone in 5 or 6 positions misses out, I can step in and I won't be brilliant, but I won't be terrible. I might not win you a game, but I won't lose you a game either. So that's why I do think he's actually had the best version of his career by becoming a squad player. Because I think if he'd stayed as a starter, there was nowhere really for him to go other than, a sidewards move. You look at that Premier League season, his last year with Villa. Chelsea win the league. He's not good enough to go there. Arsenal or United finished second. He's not good enough to go there. He was probably good enough to go to Arsenal in a squad role. In fact, he was definitely good enough to go to Arsenal in a squad role or Tottenham in a squad role. Same thing with City, but City obviously had much greater ambition. Now, at the time, he probably could have joined us and become a starter. That was probably the one big club he could have gone to and become a starter, because we just weren't in great shape at the time.
We just didn't have 28 mil to spend.
So we didn't have that type of money. No, we just didn't have that type of money at all. In fact, if you look at the summer of 2010, when he moved to City, we signed Raul Morales for 11.5 million, Paul Konchesky for 3 million, Brad Jones for 2.3 million, Christian Poulsen for 14.5 million, Danny Wilson for 2 million, John Joe Shelby for 1.7, and we got Jovanovic and Cole on free. So we spent less total than City spent on James Milner. That's just where we were at the time.
And a lot of that we still shouldn't have spent.
I would say all of that. Morelos was good for about 9 games.
We got money back as well.
We got money for him as well. So
yeah, but all the rest, we got money for Shelby, to be fair, but none of the rest worked out. I think it's fair to say that was a particularly dark time for us. But we should end it there. We have gone from the 2002 World Cup. Well, it started with Brazil. It became about the World Cup. We talked about the US men's national team. I am still outraged by 198 games in 10 years. That's just absolutely ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. 560 games in 30 years. That's absolutely ridiculous. We have talked about Diego Maradona, and we've talked about James Milner. Possibly the only time those two players will ever be discussed back to back in a podcast. But Karl, have you got anything coming out this week that you want people to know about?
I will have a few bits, but they're not finished and set for dates yet, so we'll leave that. I would probably say that this podcast and how we've ended it is a good reason why when anybody brings up trophies as a measure of how players are against one another, you should immediately smash them in the face with a dustbin lid and then put them in said.
I think that's fair. We will leave it there. We'll see you later in the week. Bye-bye.
We hope you enjoyed listening to this Anfield Index show. Please be sure to subscribe to our channel so future podcasts find their way to your device automatically. There's nothing quite like fan engagement, and we'd love to know what you think of anything discussed on this show. The best way to get in touch is over on our free Discord community, where both podcasters and listeners debate the hottest LFC topics 24/7. Sign up free now at AnfieldIndex.com/Discord. You won't regret it. You can also follow us on Twitter at Anfield Index and find us on Facebook by searching for Anfield Index. Oh, and before you go, we'd love it if you could leave us a 5-star review on your favourite podcast app. It only takes a couple of seconds, and it means the world to the people who create these free shows.